And what we want to do with this Wolf School, today's episode in the series, is just really give all of you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about wolves. Raincoast's work is very focused on the conservation of wolves in British Columbia, but we also wanted to give you a chance to learn a little more about wolf biology and conservation and ecology from a range of perspectives. So that's why we're really keen today and excited to be able to give you a chance to learn about the work of the Wolf Conservation Centre and of the work they do in terms of reintroduction and much more. So as I do that introduction, I would like to introduce our host today, Regan Downey, who is the Wolf Conservation Centre's Director of Education. So she's really the perfect fit for us. She develops and schedules and teaches many of the Wolf Conservation Centre's off-site and on-site education programs, and has a Bachelor of Science in Biology with a minor in Economics. And in addition to the role she does as Director of Education, she's also very much involved in annual red wolf and Mexican grey wolf species survival plan meetings, and an advocate for continuing to make sure that we reestablish thriving and viable populations of these species. So welcome, Regan. We're really glad to join you. And I also wanted to, especially when we do these kind of formal introductions, just to invite you to tell us a little bit more about your own journey in joining the Wolf Conservation Centre, which you shared with us, because I found it really inspiring.
Sure. So thanks for having me, Ross, and thank you to Raincoast for inviting the Wolf Center to participate in Wolf School. So my name is Regan. I'm the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center, as Ross mentioned. And I have been with the center for formally 5 years, but I actually first visited the center when I was 10. And it was the very first time I'd seen wolves in person, and really inspired me to kind of want to work with them and for them in the future. And I think that also speaks very highly of the Wolf Conservation Center's outreach and education, especially at the time as well, to really motivate people to want to continue to save wolves. So I'm a huge wolf fan and very happy that I can continue to kind of raise awareness and share my appreciation for wolves with people of all ages.
Great. Well, we're gonna ask you now to share your screen, and Regan's going to talk through some of the work that the centre does and introduce the work that they do, especially with regards to the Mexican grey wolf and reintroduction of red wolves.
Okay, great. So thanks, Ross. I'll go ahead and get started. So as Ross mentioned, we're going to be talking about red wolves tonight, Mexican gray wolves, and really a lot of the advocacy and conservation efforts that are going on right now in the United States, and how those relate to the Wolf Center, but also to recovering wolves as well. And so before we kind of get fully into this, I do want to just quickly touch on the Wolf Center's mission. Our mission is to recover wolf populations across North America, and we do this through education programming, participation in recovery programs, and advocacy efforts. So we believe quite strongly in conserving and protecting wolves and recovering wolves to their native habitats across North America. And we think this can best be done through kind of a three-pronged mission, through education, actually participating in recovery programs and releasing wolves into the wild. And then of course, with education and wild releases, you definitely need advocacy and making sure that we're constantly speaking up for wolves and fighting for their protections as well. But most importantly, giving people the tools they need to save wolves on their own. So things they can do from home and ways they can be really effective wolf advocates. But I did mention education, and education is really at the forefront of what we do as an organization. We educate tens of thousands of people every year about the importance of wolves, their role in the environment. We're working to dispel myths and really connect people to these really important native predators that deserve our protection and appreciation. And luckily, we have some really great kind of ambassadors or employees at the center that can really help bridge that gap between humans and the wild world of wolves. And those are our 3 ambassador wolves that we're going to meet in just a few minutes. So I'll just quickly introduce them, and then you'll see them in person later on during the program. But just for to be polite and to introduce them, this is Zephyr. He is one of our ambassador wolves. You'll see him tonight, and he lives with his sister Alewa, another one of our ambassadors, and they share a really large enclosure area with their younger brother Nakai. So if you have any questions about these wolves, make sure to keep them in mind. We'll be seeing them in just a few minutes, and it'll be a really great time to learn more about them, but also to learn more about wild wolves through them. But the reason these wolves are so important, and the reason they play such a really invaluable role in the center's work, is because a lot of people are afraid of wolves, and they have this idea that wolves are scary, that wolves maybe need to be managed and controlled. And this stems from really a history of persecution against wolves in this country. And it started about 400 years ago with the arrival of European settlers, and they began killing wolves, both out of what they thought was safety for themselves, but also to protect livestock. They were worried wolves might consume too many deer and elk and not leave them with enough food sources. But then they also began offering bounties. And so they were giving people money if they killed wolves. And so I do apologize if these next 2 pictures might be disturbing to some, but there were hundreds of thousands of wolves killed in the period of just a few hundred years. And thankfully, things have gotten a bit better today in terms of, not quite as many bounties, although some states still do have them. But we do still deal with persecution against wolves, and it's something that we need to speak out quite strongly against. So you'll notice the picture on the lower left says, "I support wolf extinction." That was posted in Idaho a few years ago. And the bottom right-hand photo says "No wolves," and that's actually right in the middle of Mexican gray wolf territory. We'll talk about Mexican gray wolves tonight, but they're an endangered species. And where they're living in the wild, there can be some conflicts with livestock owners and ranchers. And so we're still dealing with attitudes against wolves, maybe not quite in the same vein of being paid money to kill them as a sport, but there are still people who are trophy hunting wolves. There are still people who don't like wolves, and our center works quite strongly to kind of get rid of those mindsets, or at least try to change them in some way. But this can also better be illustrated with looking at really a piece of legislation that helped save wolves. It's the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act is really the United States kind of fundamental conservation law. And it was created in 1973, and it's managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. But it essentially will protect plants and animals that are at risk of going extinct. And so it will list them as either endangered or threatened. And then it's illegal to harm them, to kill them, shoot them, trap them, really to do anything that might tamper with their everyday way of life. And with wolves, they were given these protections. Wolves were listed as endangered in the 1970s. And this did allow for their numbers to grow and to expand once again, because they were not only given protections, but there were also specific programs and plans that were designed specifically to recover these animals and release them back into the wild. And so with the Endangered Species Act, we can actually see really a marked growth in the wolf population in the US. So if we look at this map, we're focusing specifically on the lower 48 states. Alaska does have a very large wolf population. Because of that, Alaska's wolves have never been listed under the Endangered Species Act. So we're not including them in this map. They are, of course, still important. They do face challenges. But in terms of illustrating kind of the efficacy of the Endangered Species Act, we're focusing on the lower 48 states. And so we're looking up at this empty map. Around 400 years ago, wolves were living in every single state. But as we already discussed, there was a huge drop in their population until eventually what was once over 250,000 wolves was really only about 800 in the 1970s. But thanks to the Endangered Species Act and those added protections and a few reintroduction efforts, the wolf population in the lower 48 states has grown. And so today we have wolves living in a few kind of pockets in the US. They're not found in every state. They're nowhere near close to inhabiting their native range, but they are slowly starting to recover in certain areas. So we see wolves living in the western Great Lakes states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. We also see wolves living in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. We have wolves living in Arizona and New Mexico. We also have gray wolves living up in the Pacific Northwest. So we do get some wolves moving down into Washington from British Columbia. But this is really it for the gray wolf population in the lower 48 states. And we do also have red wolves living in the lower 48 states as well. So really two species of wolf that are found in the wild in the lower 48 states would be those gray wolves and red wolves. And in terms of being listed under the Endangered Species Act, gray wolves are still listed as endangered, although they've been delisted or removed from federal protection in the northern Rocky Mountain states. So Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming actually do have hunting seasons for their wolves. Wyoming actually just killed 4 wolves last week. The state government did, but they do also have kind of a trophy hunting season where it's really anything goes for the entire year in 85% of the state. But elsewhere, for the most part, wolves are protected. They've been delisted as well in a few certain parts of states. But specifically, we're going to be focusing on 2 populations on this map that are relatively isolated from the rest. And those are Mexican gray wolves living in the Southwest, where there's 163, and then red wolves living in North Carolina, where there's really only about 9 left in the wild. And these wolves have actually been aided in their recovery thanks to reintroduction efforts and recovery programs. So in the United States, there have been 4 major relocation or reintroduction efforts. It began with the red wolf reintroduction in North Carolina in 1987. It was then followed by the release of gray wolves into Yellowstone in the mid-90s, probably the most well-known reintroduction in the US, but definitely not the first. And then Mexican gray wolves were reintroduced into the US in 1998. And then we also currently have an ongoing relocation of wolves to Isle Royale, which is an island off the coast of Michigan. It's a national park, and the National Park Service is currently in the process of relocating wolves to that island, both from Canada and from mainland US in an effort to boost what is a dwindling wolf population. But with red wolves and Mexican gray wolves in particular, they received an extra boost because they were actually brought into captivity to begin their recovery under something called a species survival plan. And so a species survival plan is a breeding and management program that's designed to ensure the long-term sustainability of captive-based animal populations. And so essentially it means organizations like the Wolf Center house and care for red wolves and Mexican gray wolves, but the goal is to get those wolves back into the wild. And so just to go into it a bit more, the SSP, it's an effort among zoos, the Fish and Wildlife Service, organizations like the Wolf Conservation Center. We work with Mexico for Mexican gray wolves, and it's all managed under the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. But to get into the nitty-gritty, it means we house and care for red wolves and Mexican gray wolves with the eventual goal of release into the wild. So we're trying to maintain those wild, elusive behaviors. We also will participate in breeding programs and carry out breeding recommendations to further the genetic diversity of these imperiled species. And then we also make recommendations for release. And again, we keep these wolves very far away from people in very large, spacious enclosures to make sure that we're protecting those wild behaviors so these wolves can be released into the wild, because that is the ultimate goal of the center. We do want a world where wolf populations kind of flourish in the wild, and where wolves don't need to live in captivity because they're able to live in the wild where they're meant to live. So before we head up and see some wolves, we'll just talk pretty quickly about our red wolves and Mexican gray wolves, because we're hoping to see some tonight, but because they're very shy and very afraid of people, we can't guarantee it. So we'll just very quickly touch on kind of who these animals are before we head up to the enclosures. So this is what a red wolf looks like. Pretty petite in stature, very long legs, very large ears, but their average body size is only about 50 to 70, maybe 50 to 80 pounds. So not quite as large as you might be imagining. And they are native to the southeastern United States. So everywhere within this kind of black and gray striped area, that's native red wolf range. But just as with gray wolves, predator control programs, habitat loss caused the red wolf population to drop quite drastically until there was only a very small population left in the Gulf Coast region of Texas and Louisiana. And scientists captured over 400 canids. So they weren't sure if they were red wolves or coyotes or really what type of canid they were. So they brought them into captivity, ran a series of genetic tests, and realized that of those 400 plus, only 17 were pure red wolves. And of those 17, only 14 red wolves actually were able to breed and contribute to the red wolf recovery effort. So those 14 red wolves were living in captivity and they were breeding. And then eventually the captive population was large enough that an actual reintroduction effort could begin in 1987. And that's when they were released into this blue highlighted area along the coast of North Carolina. And that's where they currently live today. But as I mentioned earlier, as you saw on the map, their population has dropped to just about 9. And it is not because red wolves can't survive in the wild. It is, however, due to some mismanagement and some lack of action in terms of their recovery effort. So if we look at this graph, this is a red wolf population timeline, and it starts in 1988, which is right after red wolves were released into the wild, and it continues up until today. And you'll notice in the beginning, the population is growing quite rapidly, and that's due to a combination of adult releases from captivity, so releasing adult wolves, but also beginning in 2002, the Fish and Wildlife Service began cross-fostering captive-born pups as well. So taking pups born in captivity, placing them with wild wolves, the wolves adopt them as their own. And this worked. This allowed the population to grow to over 130 wolves by the mid-2000s, by some estimates even close to 150. But then we start to see a bit of a decline. You'll notice there's been illegal killing that starts to cause a drop in the population. And then in 2013, North Carolina state's, it's essentially the wildlife agency, began allowing coyote hunting in that area. Coyotes and red wolves are very similar in size. And so red wolves are being killed and mistaken for coyotes. But then we get in 2014, we really get kind of a stop on the part of the Fish and Wildlife Service. They took a few steps back to assess the program, and they essentially stopped doing everything that was working for red wolves. They stopped releasing red wolves. They actually began giving landowners permits to kill red wolves on their property, and the population just dropped drastically. But not surprisingly, even with that drop in the population, a poll revealed that 73% of North Carolina residents do support red wolf recovery. But in 2019, there were no pups born. And in 2020, there were no pups born in the wild. And so actually just this past winter, the Fish and Wildlife Service did bring in a new red wolf male to the recovery area in an attempt to slowly begin to increase this population once again. So red wolves are dealing with quite a lot of challenges, but I would like to quickly introduce you to the red wolves that live at our center in case we don't see them. We believe quite strongly in, of course, recognizing wolves as individuals and recognizing their value as individuals, not just at a species level. So we have several family groups living here. We have a pair that we might see tonight, Pike and Lava. But we also have a family of 6 red wolves that live off exhibit. It's mom and dad, Jack and Charlotte, with their 4 kids. And then we also have a family of 10 red wolves. And this is a really great family because it's a multi-generational family unit. So it's what you most typically see in the wild, mom and dad, and then siblings of varying ages, all kind of working together as one cohesive unit. And then, just to wrap up our discussion in here, we'll touch on Mexican gray wolves quite quickly as well. So Mexican gray wolves are a subspecies of gray wolf, but they are listed separately under the Endangered Species Act. They are listed as endangered. And right now, there are about 163 in the wild. But at one point, they were declared to be extinct in the wild. And there were only 5 remaining in the wild. And they were sent to the U.S. from Mexico to begin this binational recovery effort. And as part of this binational recovery effort, wolves are, of course, released into the wild. This map in front of you shows where wolves are currently living if they're Mexican gray wolves. And you'll notice a few different zones. Really, the most important is Wolf Management Zone 1. This is right in the middle of the Apache National Forest, the Gila National Forest in Arizona and New Mexico. And it's where wolves are released from captivity. Again, that's a goal of our center, to actually get wolves into the wild. And we've been able to release a few of our wolves into the wild since we joined this recovery effort in the early 2000s. But we do still have wolves living at our center as well. We currently have 21 Mexican gray wolves living here. We have a family of, it's technically 8, but you'll see why it's 9 right now. So we have a family of 9. We have another family of Mexican gray wolves, parents Belle and Rhett with their 4 children. We have a duo, Diego and Valentia, that we might see tonight. And then we also have another family of 5. So these are all of the Mexican gray wolves that live at the Wolf Conservation Center. But you'll notice one of these pictures isn't quite as up to date as the others. And that's because one of these wolves was actually chosen for a very exciting cross foster or a release into the wild when she was just a few days old. And so this will be the last story that we'll do kind of in front of the computer, then we'll switch up to the wolves. But this is too exciting not to share. So this is a Mexican gray wolf we nicknamed Hope. She was born at our center in 2019 to parents Trumpet and Lighthawk. She's a Mexican gray wolf. And she was born at the same time a family of wild wolves in Arizona had given birth to pups. The Fish and Wildlife Service was monitoring those wolves, and they knew that they had given birth. And that meant Hope, our wolf here, was able to actually go live with that wild wolf family and grow up as a wild wolf. And it's a very, really the stars have to align for this to work. Because pups have to be born at the same time, but you also have a very tight window in which to get them out to the wild. You have to get these wolves out into the wild before their eyes open. And a wolf's eyes open at around 12 to 14 days old. So very, very tight window. We had a lot of help though, which is really great. But we were essentially told that we were bringing Hope out to Arizona. And so this is a map, again, of the Mexican wolf recovery area. And we'll focus in on this area here. And specifically, we're focusing on these orange dots or these locations because Mexican gray wolves wear tracking collars. And these 3 dots are actually where 3 Mexican gray wolves that make up the Saffel family are living in Arizona. And they had had pups at about the same time Hope was born at our center, which meant we went into our enclosure. We took Hope from her family. We understand that it must have been quite sad for the family to lose Hope, but we also kept thinking of how exciting it would be for Hope to grow up as a wild wolf. Again, it's what we dream of for all of our wolves. And so Hope actually was flown on a private airplane. Someone donated their plane. They flew Hope all the way across the country to Arizona. And this was going to be her new home, the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. You'll notice it's quite wooded. Some people assume Mexican gray wolves live in the desert, but they're much more used to the woodlands of the Southwest. And she was brought to the Fish and Wildlife team, the interagency field team, and they were actually going to bring Hope to her new family. And so you might be wondering, how exactly does a barely 2-week-old wolf pup travel? Well, it's in a backpack, and she's surrounded with heating pads and towels to keep her nice and warm and help regulate her body temperature. And I should note, usually wolves are cross-fostered with other siblings. But in this case, Hope had to go it alone because the Fish and Wildlife Service would only cross-foster 12 pups, and Hope was the 12th pup. So she had to make this journey by herself. And after a few hours of hiking, they arrived at the Saffel family wolf den. So it's essentially a pile of rocks, but that's where the family was living. And what we're looking at is actually kind of like a skylight or the sunroof. It's a hole in the ceiling. and they were going to place Hope through the top of the den. So Hope was taken out of the backpack and she was passed over to a biologist, and the biologist then kind of dropped her through the top of the den. It wasn't a far drop at all. But Hope actually landed on top of her wild wolf mom, and within just a few seconds had begun nursing. And it's so exciting. Here's just a little picture of all of those wild pups and Hope in that wolf den. And it's so great because it speaks to how loving and caring wolves are, that they'll readily adopt pups that aren't their own and raise them. And of course, wolves can count. So wild wolf mom knew that she had an extra pup there. But again, that caring nature, they're going to adopt pups and raise them. And so Hope is out in the Southwest. She is our most recent release, and we're so excited that she's able to grow up, really spend her entire life in the wild. She'll never know what it's like to live behind a fence, and it's something we wish for all of our wolves. So when we get the chance, we jump at it. But with that, we've spent enough time, I think, in here. So we are going to go meet some wolves. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm actually going to, I guess, vanish for just a few minutes. I'm going to make the jump from my office up to the wolves, but we're going to turn things over, I guess, to Ross and my coworker Chris, and I'll see you guys in just a minute.
Great, thank you so much. There's lots of questions here for us to answer, and we're going to just see if we can switch so you can see exactly what's happening in the Wolf Conservation Center, and we're going to be talking to you a little bit more about those wolves in just a second. Just give me a second to click some buttons here. I'm just going to spotlight your video there, so hopefully you can now see. And I don't know if Chris, if you're there, if you can tell us what we're looking at. Or maybe in the meantime, we can just enjoy these howls. So I think, like, Regan will tell us a little bit later about these wolves play a certain role and access and engagement with the public for the other wolves, including some of the wolves that are reintroduced, is managed somewhat differently. And Regan can talk to us a little bit about that in a second here as she makes her way to the stage, I think.
Okay, so hi everyone. I don't know if any of the howling translated over, but these are 3 of our ambassador wolves. So we mentioned them really briefly in the office, but these 3 wolves are here as representatives because the rest of our wolves, we have 42 wolves in total. The rest of our wolves actually live primarily off exhibit as a way to safeguard their wild, natural, elusive behaviors. And you can feel free to get closer if you want, Chris. But as you can see, these wolves are quite curious. They're not really afraid of people. They've lost a lot of that natural wariness around humans. Wolves in the wild, of course, are quite wary because they know people are dangerous and people can do quite horrible things to them. But with these ambassador wolves, they're used to people, so they can really help bridge the gap between the human world and the wild world. So Chris, I don't know if you want to get a little bit closer. You'll see a wolf standing way back behind a log tower, and that's Alewa. Alewa is a gray wolf, and she's 9 years old. And the wolf who's a little skittish, a little startled, is her younger brother. His name is Nakai, and he is actually 6 years old. He was born in 2014, and they live with their brother Zephyr. So Zephyr is sniffing around here, but he's 9 years old as well. And these are our 3 ambassadors. And you might be noticing they're all slightly different colors, different in appearance, but they're all gray wolves. Gray wolves can actually have a variety of coat colors, black, brown, gray, white, tan. And so even though they do look slightly different, they are all siblings, and they are all a really invaluable part of the center and our recovery effort as well. And you can also see their enclosure is quite large in size. And Zephyr's going into one of his dens. So to make their enclosure as wild and as natural as possible, we do provide these wolves with a variety of different structures. They have a log tower as a way to give them a really great vantage point so they can move around, they can see different things. Because in the wild, a wolf's territory is quite large and very vast. But because it's so large, it encompasses a variety of landforms. And we want to mimic that as best as we can. Of course, we understand that we're in Westchester County. We're about an hour outside of New York City. And so it can be a bit more challenging for us to mimic certain aspects of a wild environment. But we do the best we can. So they also have a pond. It's kind of the closest we get to coastal wolves here in New York. They do enjoy going for some swims to cool off. And you'll also notice that they're looking very lean as well. So this is actually my favorite time of year for wolves because they've lost their really fluffy winter undercoat and they're ready for summer. So they are actually, they've shed that undercoat and all they're left with is their guard hairs or their outer coat. And it makes them look unique, acts as a rain jacket, but it also kind of prevents them from getting too hot in the summer. And they'll slowly start to grow that, regrow that undercoat as well as we're getting shorter days. That's a signal to their bodies that winter is coming. But I think what we might do, Chris, if we want to start heading down, we'll move closer to the wolves so we can actually see them from different angles as well.
Regan, I wonder if you could tell us as well, like where do some of the wolves come from? Like it seems like you get them from different sources, and I know like some stay there and some are reintroduced into the wild. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about where the wolves come from that are located at the center.
Sure, definitely. That's a great question, Ross. So these three ambassador wolves here are captive born. They don't actually, they're not red wolves. They're not Mexican gray wolves. And as we discussed in the office, those are really the only wolves that have active captive to wild recovery programs. So these wolves can't live in the wild, which is why they're here as ambassadors. But the rest of our wolves, our red wolves and Mexican gray wolves, are either born at our center as part of those breeding efforts, as part of those recovery programs. But we actually have some wolves that have been born elsewhere at other centers and come to live here. We have a lot of really great space here, great enclosure size, but maybe they're also sent here because they will hopefully be having pups with one of our wolves. But we also serve as a sanctuary of sorts. We have a Mexican gray wolf living at our center. He's named Lighthawk, but he was actually born in the wild in Arizona. And he came to live at our center a few years ago because in the wild in Arizona and New Mexico, even though these wolves are living on really large national forests, they're usually, unfortunately, sharing the landscape with livestock. And in the U.S., wolf livestock conflict can be really tense. And sometimes, rather than prioritizing native predators, wolves are actually taken out of the wild to allow for domestic livestock to have kind of a place to live. Even though these domestic livestock, oh, perfect, we'll move up to Zephyr. Even though these domestic animals can really wreak havoc on the environment, and wolves are great for the environment, sometimes wolves get the short end of the stick and they're taken out of the wild. So Lighthawk actually came to live with us a few years ago. And while it's worked out nicely for him, he has a wife, he has a mate here. Wolves are monogamous, and we do like to highlight their similarities to people. So he does have a mate, her name is Trumpet, and they have kids together. But we do think that Lighthawk kind of got the final say because his daughter Hope is the pup who was cross-fostered into the wild. And by a funny twist of fate, it wasn't planned this way. His sister, because he was wild born, his sister still lives in the wild. and she's actually Hope's adoptive mom. So she is the breeding female of the Saffel pack, and that's where Hope was placed. So Hope is actually in the wild being raised by her biological aunt, which is a nice twist of things, I would say.
And there's a few questions here, Regan. Are you open to taking a few questions just from the feed here?
Of course. Yeah,
So
hit me with it.
there was one is around, like, do you change the makeup of their environment?
So we do like to give the wolves a variety of enrichment items. We really want these wolves to always feel very active and engaged, because wolves are highly intelligent, and we never want them to feel as though they're not living the best life they can. Understandably, of course, the best life for a wolf is a wild life. But so we do try to give them the best life here that we can. So we do give them different structures. That log tower that we highlighted earlier was actually built by some local Cub Scouts. We have a lot of scout groups in the area that will build structures for the wolves. If you hear things hitting metal, we have a lot of things falling from trees right now. So we do give them a lot of different items, different structures, but we'll do a lot of natural scent enrichment as well. So giving the wolves natural scents they might find in the wild, or with our ambassador wolves, sometimes things they would never encounter in the wild, but could really cause them to think, and they have to wonder. And it really does so much for them in terms of keeping them very energized and entertained. So yes, we do try to make their enclosures, their spaces here as interesting as possible. And we do sometimes switch wolves from enclosure to enclosure as well, both based on family size and just, again, for general enrichment too.
So I'm kind of curious, could you say a little bit more about, like, just how you, like, what work you do in terms of augmenting populations, about how you might augment the selection of mating pairs? Like, I'm
Sure.
kind of curious how that process works.
Yeah, definitely. So it's quite an interesting process, and it's quite thorough. It's quite an in-depth process as well. So both the red wolf recovery program and the Mexican gray wolf recovery program work with population biologists, and these population biologists will figure out exactly how many wolves need to breed each year for the captive population to grow X amount. And once they determine how many pups need to be born, it's then kind of, well, okay, if we need 15 pups born, how many breeding pairs would that have to be? Assuming that not every breeding pair actually breeds, assuming not every pup actually survives to adulthood. So there's a lot of what ifs that kind of factor into this overall calculation. But essentially, wolves are paired based on genetics. So I know it sounds quite romantic, but wolves are, with Mexican gray wolves and red wolves, they are so genetically imperiled because Mexican gray wolves descend from just 7 unique genetic founders, and red wolves descend from just 14. And so in order for a population to be robust, it has to be robust in both size, but also in genetics. And so wolves are paired essentially based on lowest inbreeding coefficient. So these population biologists actually have a computer algorithm, and they'll actually enter information about these wolves, because all of these wolves descend from just 7 founders. We know all of their lineages. And so these algorithms and these scientists actually will then match wolves based on their level of relatedness to each other, but also the level of relatedness to the entire population as a whole. And then after these pairings are decided, they're decided in the summer, we then spend fall and winter actually getting wolves ready for breeding season. Wolves are monoestrous, which means they breed once a year. And so females go into heat in usually late January, early February. And so if we're introducing wolves for breeding season, we of course can't guarantee that these wolves will get along. We're asking a lot of them to go live with a wolf they've never met and to reproduce and have pups. And so we try to get them living together a while before breeding season fully begins. And then we keep our fingers crossed, and we hope that 63 days after some breeding ties, we have some pups. but we do also sometimes do artificial inseminations, and we'll actually artificially inseminate females. And that's done with the Mexican gray wolf program. And we've done a few of those as well, but we've had no pups resulting from the artificial inseminations. And we actually had no pups born this year either, but we did have pups born in 2019 and actually 22 puppies born in 2018 for our largest year ever. So breeding season is always exciting, both for us and most definitely for the wolves.
Okay. And I'm just trying to field a few questions here.
Sure. Actually, we can shift up too if you want.
Yeah, no, this is really great. Like it's fascinating. I'm curious if you could just tell us more about what might like an average day look like for the wolves. Like, is there a certain set times for certain activities or around feeding? I'm kind of curious what if there's like a schedule or how the interaction works with the different wolves through the day.
Sure, that's a great question, Ross. And so we're going to walk up a bit while we answer that. So we actually do not feed our wolves every day. Wolves in the wild will usually on average eat about once a week. And so we mimic that pattern here as much as we can. So our red wolves and Mexican gray wolves are fed roadkill deer, so a deer carcass once a week. And our ambassador wolves, like Alewa up on top of the den, they actually get smaller meals more frequently. So you might hear some wolves howling in the background as well. So they're fed about 3 times a week. But other than that, we try to let them be kind of as on their own as they can. With our red wolves and Mexican gray wolves, we have to really kind of leave them alone. We're very hands off, and that's so they don't get very used to people. But what's great is these wolves are living with their families. And so they're living in a really similar group that they would be living in the wild. And so we don't really need to worry about giving them anything because they're with their families. And they're able to play with each other. They rest together, they eat together. And what's actually really great is we have live streaming cameras in all of our enclosures. So people can actually watch these wolves at any time of the day, regardless of where you are in the world. And we actually have a global audience that will watch these wolves on webcams to learn more about wolf behavior, but also just to check in and see what their favorite wolves are doing.
And there's another question here that I think we've kind of discussed this a little bit, but it just seems like it warrants asking. Of the wolves at your center, since they have become habituated to humans and have lost their protective fear of humans, can any of them realistically be introduced for the first time into the wild?
So sorry if I get overpowered. A lot of our red wolves are howling right now. I don't know if you can kind of hear that shrieking sound, but that's critically endangered red wolves that you're hearing. But so actually the only wolves at our center that are used to people or socialized would be our ambassador wolves. The rest of our other wolves, all 39, are still quite wild and quite elusive, and they can actually survive quite well on their own in the wild. So if they were chosen for release into the wild, they would leave our center and they would actually go live at what's called a pre-release facility for a few months, actually and however long they would be there. But that would be a way to allow them to adjust to a new landscape. But also if they're coming from another center where they might be seeing people more often, it's a good chance to kind of reset. At our center, a majority of our wolves really never see people except for once a week when they are getting that dead deer dragged into their enclosure. So really all of our wolves are great release candidates. They're just waiting for the chance to get released. They're waiting for permission, as are we, from the Fish and Wildlife Service.
That's great. And there's some other great questions here. So do the behavioral patterns of the wolves change based on the seasons? I think that's a question about the wolves in the center. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So we definitely notice that wolves are more active in the winter. When they grow those really thick undercoats, they're ready for temperatures. I'm going to say this in Fahrenheit, so I apologize. Below, -30, maybe to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they're much more active in the cold weather. the first snow of the year is always a really fun time for these wolves. In the summer, they're usually a bit more, they'll hunker down. They're not quite as active. We do notice changes in behavior in the winter and breeding season as hormones are raging. But even now, just looking at Alewa, she's the wolf on top of the den in front of you. You'll notice she's quite relaxed. And it's actually because, one, it's a lot cooler here than it has been this week. We've had a bit of a hot flash. But it's also a time of day when she would prefer to be more active. Wolves are actually crepuscular, which means they're typically more active at dawn and dusk. And so that is when we tend to see wolves being a bit more active. It's also why one of the reasons we chose this time slot today as well, to try to capitalize on those kind of natural peaks in their activity levels.
And there's a slightly different question. I think it is about the complexities of reintroduction, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase a little bit, but someone's asking that given what happens with Fish and Wildlife Services in terms of, in some instances in some states allowing wolves to be killed, and at the same time be involved in reintroduction, like the question is, how do we get them to be more respectable of the rights of all wolves to live? But I'm kind of curious more broadly of how do you find in your experience at the center that challenge where it seems like that there's this shift in political complexities of how we're able to allow reintroduction programs, and sometimes that might mean that certain aspects of the law need to be reviewed or less stringent and enable just to allow reintroduction to happen in the first place. So does that make sense? Yeah.
It's definitely a complex question, but it's definitely a great question to ask, because when we're talking about wolf conservation, we do have to talk about recovery. And right now with wolves, their status is really interwoven with state agencies and the federal government. So it's a great question to ask, and it's very timely. So with wolves, they do have these recovery programs, these reintroduction efforts, but reintroduction is quite a complex issue, and there's a lot of stakeholders that kind of factor in. So state agencies will work with the Fish and Wildlife Service. You'll sometimes get various stakeholder, like whether it's conservation groups or hunting groups, that will also kind of factor into these kind of policies and this decision making. And it can be quite challenging when you have a lot of people kind of coming up to the table and wanting different things. But I think at the end of the day, what's most important is that we realize that when we reintroduce wolves, we're resetting and rebalancing the environment and nature. And so I think we need to keep that really at the forefront of our minds. We're doing this for the wolves. And it can be quite challenging because not everyone goes into it with that mindset. But we're the Wolf Conservation Center, and we think that even though a wildlife can be a challenging life for wolves, dealing with other wolves and humans and potential disease, it can be quite challenging, but it's also the most rewarding life that they could ever have. So we as a center really believe quite strongly in that even if a wolf is released into the wild for just a short time, it must be better than spending their entire life in captivity. I know if I think about it too much, I tend to tear up, but imagine, I think we can actually even all relate right now with so many of us having social distanced and staying at home. I know we're all going a little stir crazy, and we'd like to be able to go where we want and do what we want. And it's also very important to translate that over to wolves. They're waiting for us to give them the chance to live in the wild. And so that's why the Wolf Center does everything we can to push wolves into the wild, whether it's filing a lawsuit or encouraging people to take action and reach out to state agencies or the federal government. Really now is the time to get wolves back out into the wild. We owe it to them.
So can you say a little bit more about that? Because I know like Raincoast has this approach of informed advocacy where we're using peer-reviewed research to inform what we're advocating for in terms of wildlife policy, including around wolves. And I know like some people on the feed here are asking what they can do to help. I was wondering if you could say more about what tools or resources the center provides to help people be advocates for wolves?
Sure. And I love that Raincoast really pushes science. We push science as well. We think the best policies for wolves come about through science. And so that's one of the main things we're pushing is just really science-based recovery and science-based protection for wolves. Science has shown that there's no need to kill wolves. Wolves don't pose a threat to you. They don't, killing wolves will not stop livestock attacks. Killing wolves will not, increase the number of prey available for human hunters. And so we do push peer-reviewed science, but we also try to make that science as accessible to the public as we can. And so we will often, we'll translate science or these scientific papers, push them out to the public. So we're creating a more educated and more aware audience of wolf supporters. But we also will create what we call action alerts. And for example, Washington State has a population of wolves, and they are in the eastern third of the state. They're actually managed by the state government, but they're listed as endangered in that state. And Washington, ever since 2012, really every summer, they've actually been killing wolves in order to protect livestock that are grazing on public lands. And it's quite horrible. They shoot the wolves from helicopters. They actually killed an entire family earlier this month. And so we have been giving our supporters tools to contact Washington's governor, to contact the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we've noticed a lot of people taking action, but they're also quite frustrated. And it can be frustrating, when science is telling you what works and then an agency does the very opposite. It can be quite frustrating and quite challenging. But it does work. If we're all using our collective voices, we're much louder together. And so we really do encourage people to take really constant, continued action on behalf of wolves. But then something else we try to do to raise awareness, and this might seem silly compared to everything else, but we really try to make wolves a part of everyday life. So they're not something that's really mythical or, you only see it, if you go somewhere special. We post pictures and videos of our wolves constantly because we want wolves to be so ingrained in your everyday life that you are so appreciative of them and that you can't really imagine your life without them. And so that's something we also try to do through our various social media pages as well.
Yeah, and I think we'll share in the follow-up some ways to reconnect. And I'm just starting to think about last questions here. We've still got 5 minutes here, Regan, so we've got a little bit of time. But I really wanted to ask you, what is, you shared your a little bit of your own story there at the beginning. I'm kind of curious, having spent so much of your life involved with wolves and so intimately. What's the thing that perhaps most inspires you about wolves?
Well, so that's actually a good question, and I think everyone has a different answer. But one of the things that I think draws so many of us to wolves is just how similar they are to people. Their family structures closely mimic ours. They communicate with each other in a variety of ways. They play together, they love together, they live together. And I think it would be quite cruel of us as a species to assume that we're the only species capable of feeling those intense emotions or these strong bonds. And so I think that's what drew me to wolves in the first place. But then as you read about wolves or, just observe them, you realize just how valuable these animals are. And especially with the state of the environment today, we really do need to focus on restoring and rebalancing ecosystems. And wolves are a key part of that. So while I think many of us are originally drawn to wolves for their appearance or their howling or just something of that sort, we realize eventually that they're connected to a much healthier world. And if we want a healthy world, we need wolves.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And Ross, I hope you don't mind, but can I try to get Alewa to howl?
For sure, go for it.
Okay, I'm going to step away. Just my howl can be a little bit loud, and I don't want anyone with headphones in to have a hard time. So I'm going to back up. That's our lazy howler, Aleoa. If anyone's familiar with our YouTube channel, she's gone viral several times for her lazy howls. But Ross, if we also have maybe just for these last few minutes, we can head up to see if any of our red wolves or Mexican gray wolves might be out.
Sure, yeah, and we'll just, like if we go over a few minutes, people who need to jump off can jump off. I think we're okay with that. Lots of people are telling us that their dogs at home are also engaging with these howls.
Oh yeah, it's quite appropriate. I think today is National Dog Day, so it's a fun day to tie in wolves. So we're actually walking up towards part of our endangered species facility. And so over to our right, this is actually what we call our on-exhibit red wolf enclosure. But we're going to move up just a bit, and we'll kind of straddle both our red wolf and Mexican gray wolf enclosures to see if any of these wolves are out. But you'll notice, even as we're walking, it's much quieter up here, but it's also very densely wooded because these wolves are really not meant to see people. So we don't need to worry about vantage points for us seeing them. It's more to keep them wild, keep them elusive. And if we see them, great. If we don't, great. So this enclosure up here is home to 2 Mexican gray wolves. Oh, you'll see one moving if you come up, Chris. So you'll see back in that enclosure, I don't know how visible she is, but that's Valentia. She's a Mexican gray wolf. And she lives in here with Diego. He's her mate. They have not had pups, so they're not actually a breeding pair. Oh, she's coming a little bit closer to us. Here, we'll stop talking just to be. So you'll notice she's sniffing the air. She's quite aware we're here. And so this is an endangered Mexican gray wolf. And we'll back up just a bit just to give her some space because, again, we don't want to encourage these wolves to approach people. But this is Valentia. And you'll notice she's quite striking. She's also quite small in size. Mexican gray wolves are the smallest subspecies of gray wolf in North America, but they're also the most genetically distinct. Remember, they descend from just 7 founders. And you'll notice she's sniffing at the air. Wolves have, of course, a variety of senses that they use to distinguish. And so howls are great to communicate, but their nose is really quite advanced, and they can pick up scents much better than we can. Scientists actually estimate that their sense of smell is 100 times better than ours. And we'll back up just a bit more just to leave her with some space. Again, we really do everything we can not to encourage these wolves to approach people at all.
Yeah, it seems like thanks so much for this. It's amazing to listen to them and see them and I think everyone's commenting in here, Regan, just on how fantastic you've been and the center is in terms of the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I think the center's I'm biased, but I think the center is quite great as well. So I'm glad others agree. And
we do want to finish shortly just to make sure we kind of respect that time slot, which is fine. Sure. And we're really keen to make sure that we come back and visit again. But I'm kind of curious, Regan, if you had a last message to our audience here, what might that be?
I would really just encourage everyone to kind of assess their life and how they can, better support wolves at home. If you really enjoyed tonight's program, if you're a supporter of Raincoast or a supporter of the Wolf Conservation Center, maybe think about how you can take your support a step further, whether it's writing to your elected official, whether you're in Canada or the U.S. Wolves need support, really everywhere. And just think about how you can continue to be really a staunch supporter of wolves. Although wolves are quite vocal, their voices don't really translate to protection and to people. So I think it's important for us to be their voices right now. And if people need guidance for that, I would suggest they either reach out to us or reach out to you at Raincoast, Ross, to learn more about taking action.
Yeah. Well, there's always more questions that we can answer. I know a number of people were asking about I think they were really asking, how do I become a Regan? But how do I become a wolf conservationist or a wolf scientist? And we will have another wolf conservation scientist or wolf researcher and biologist, Heather Bryan from Raincoast, who will be on the third episode. So that's next week. I'm glad you're coming back into the shot there for a moment. No, it's good. Like, it's great. Yeah, we just wanted to say thank you to you and to the Centre for hosting us and giving us this really amazing experience. We know we'd love to come back. And for all the audience, thanks for joining us. Thanks for all these fantastic questions. We do hope you'll join further episodes, and we will make sure that Wolf Conservation Centre and Raincoast, you'll have the website details. But Regan, I wonder if you could just read out the website for the Wolf Conservation Centre so people can visit for more information.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so our website is super easy. It's NY, we're in New York State, so nywolf.org. So nywolf.org. Or just Google Wolf Conservation Center, we'll pop right up.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much to our listeners and to you, Regan, and to the Wolves. We'll hopefully see you for further episodes. Yeah, and thanks again to everyone for joining. We'll see you again next week. We're going to say goodbye for the night. So thank you very much and take care.
Great. Thank you, Ross. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.